Welcome back to The Explainer. Honestly, if someone asked me to create a 10 minutes video breaking down exactly why organizations fail, this case study would absolutely be my go-to example. We're putting on our detective hats today to perform an autopsy on a spectacular failure in school leadership and planning. It is basically a masterclass in what not to do. And the crazy part? The lessons we're going to uncover apply to literally any team, business, or organization you might be running. So, let's jump right in. I want you to picture this scenario. What actually happens when a public secondary school decides to plan its entire future? We're talking daily operations, financial budgets, long-term strategic goals, completely in secret. What if they rely on just a tiny, isolated handful of people? It sounds like a guaranteed recipe for disaster, right? Well, today we're going to look at the exact fallout of that decision. We're going to examine the symptoms, diagnose the root causes, and figure out the cure. Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. First, the cost of isolated planning. Second, the cascade of organizational failure. Third, the centralized black box. Fourth, the financial tax of exclusion. And finally, the engine of sustainable improvement. All right, Section 1, the cost of isolated planning. Let's look at the symptoms of this crisis. Okay, so imagine a public secondary school sitting down to prep its school improvement plan, the SIP, and its annual implementation plan, the AIP. But there's a huge catch. Participation is strictly limited to just the school head and a few hand-picked teachers. It's a totally closed circle. Key stakeholders were intentionally locked out of the room. I mean, we're talking parents, alums, barangay officials, local industries, and indigenous community representatives, all completely excluded. This is a massive unforced error. Think about it. When you exclude local industries, you're cutting off potential funding and real-world partnerships before they even start. Ignore indigenous community reps? Well, you pretty much guarantee your strategies are going to lack cultural responsiveness and fail the exact students who need tailored support the most. So what actually happens after a year of operating like this? The results were a total system failure. After just 1 year, the consequences were undeniable. First off, reading scores actually declined. The academic core of the whole institution suffered. Second, and this is wild, budget utilization hit only 60%. A massive 40% chunk of the budget was left completely unused. In an educational setting that represents thousands of dollars meant for critical learning materials, facility upgrades, and student support programs that just evaporated because leadership didn't know how to deploy it. And third, complete community dissatisfaction. The community was totally alienated. They had zero consultation, so they were frustrated, angry, and frankly, they had every right to be. Moving on to Section 2, the cascade of organizational failure. Let's diagnose these root causes. You know, failure at this scale doesn't just happen overnight. It's not one bad event, it's a chain reaction. One insular decision to exclude the community triggers this systemic collapse, basically knocking over domino after domino. When leadership operates in a vacuum like that, the initial mistake compounds. It creates a ripple effect that touches literally every operational corner of the organization. Let's break down how this freefall actually happens. So there are 3 sequential steps here. Step 1 is the trigger, which was that limited stakeholder involvement. Because the SIP and AIP were built without meaningful community input, the plans fundamentally failed to reflect the actual needs of the learners. That naturally leads into Step 2, the blind spot. This is the total lack of needs-based planning. Decisions were based only on the insular perspectives of the school staff. Since they didn't consult outsiders, critical resources and local barriers to learning went completely unidentified. Their interventions just totally missed the mark. Which brings us to Step 3, the freefall. Weak monitoring and feedback. Because the stakeholders were excluded from day one, there was no mechanism for them to provide feedback. That declining reading performance, it went completely unnoticed by leadership until it was way too late to fix it. Now for Section 3, the centralized black box and the governance voids it creates. When decision-making is hoarded by a tiny group, you create what we call a centralized black box. This massive failure in distributed leadership creates 3 huge governance voids. Void 1 is weak transparency. Stakeholders were kept completely in the dark, which obviously destroyed community trust. Void 2 is the absence of shared accountability, and this is probably the most dangerous one. If you hoard the planning, you hoard the responsibility. The community didn't help build the programs, so they felt zero ownership over them. When things failed, there was no shared safety net, leaving leadership totally isolated in their failure. And void 3 is limited inclusivity. By aggressively keeping diverse voices out, the school's strategies became totally disconnected from reality on the ground. Let's look exactly at who was left out, because the specifics are super important here. They excluded parents and alums, the very people most invested in student success. They left out barangay officials, totally missing out on crucial local government alignment. They excluded indigenous community representatives, completely damaging the cultural responsiveness of their strategies. And they ignored local industries, throwing away strategic partnerships and resource sharing. When you lock the door on these groups, you're literally locking out your best assets and your most vital problem solvers. Which brings us to Section 4, the financial tax of exclusion. This is the real cost of that black box. Ignoring your community comes with a very real financial tax. When all your resources pour into a broken funnel built behind closed doors, the money isn't just poorly spent. Massive chunks of it simply leak out and go to waste. The money enters the top of the funnel with huge potential. But because the foundation is cracked by secrecy, the organization completely fails to capture that value. Let's compare exactly where the money went. Path A is the 60% of the budget that they actually utilized. But here is the catch. It was incredibly poorly prioritized. Without stakeholder consultation, funds went to pet projects that totally failed to address the school's most urgent needs. The resources were spent, sure, but they were severely undermaximized. Then you have Path B, that 40% unused budget, the leaky bucket. This unspent money points to huge procurement failures and systemic weaknesses in financial planning. Even worse, it represents missed resource mobilization. By failing to engage local industries and alums, they lost out on resources they could have easily leveraged. Plus, this lack of transparency led to deep community concerns about financial accountability. Exclusion literally costs you money, for sure. Finally, Section 5, the engine of sustainable improvement. Let's talk about rebuilding collaborative leadership. So I want to ask you directly, how do we reverse this free fall? If your organization, whether it's a school, a startup, or a big community project, gets trapped in one of these centralized black boxes, how do you dismantle it and rebuild trust? To build a real engine of sustainable improvement, 3 key gears have to turn together. And watch how these directly cure those governance voids we just talked about. First, establish inclusive planning. You have to invite everyone to the table when creating foundational plans: parents, learners, teachers, indigenous reps, local partners. This cures the void of limited inclusivity. Second, promote collaborative leadership. Dismantle the silos. Practice shared decision-making so stakeholders actually build ownership, completely eliminating that absence of shared accountability. And third, strengthen monitoring and accountability. Set up a diverse team to regularly review performance and budget execution and present those reports in open community meetings. That effectively ends the era of weak transparency. The source material also points out some really practical, modern tools to make this happen. To truly dismantle these silos, organizations need to implement tech integration solutions. Use digital platforms to keep absolutely everyone informed in real time. Deploy online surveys to capture diverse voices continuously, not just once a year. Leverage comprehensive school information systems so that critical data, like a drop in reading scores or a budget bottleneck, is highly visible early on. That empowers leadership to course correct before a free fall even starts. Technology can make this kind of participatory governance faster and easier than ever before. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to seriously chew on regarding your own teams. Are your organization's plans a truly shared vision built on the collective wisdom of your community, or are they just a centralized black box waiting to fail? Remember, collaboration isn't just some nice cultural bonus. As we've seen today, it's absolutely crucial. It's the fundamental engine of sustainable success. Thank you so much for joining me to break this down, and I highly encourage you to rigorously examine your own planning processes this week. Catch you next time.